Hello, I'm Elizabeth Lumley, and we're here for a special FinTECHTalent's Fireside Chat. So joining me today is Collin Lyons of ustwo. How are you?
I'm well.
We're going to talk about one of my favorite topics, and a topic that is not unfamiliar to anyone who works in fintech or financial services, especially over the past 10 years, and that's digital transformation. You know, there are a lot of projects going on. I'm sure a lot of people watching us have this chat have been involved in some of these digital transformation projects. But recently there's been a little bit of a feeling in the air that a lot of these projects are really just theater or aren't really going anywhere. So why does it seem like so many digital transformation projects sort of stagnate?
Well, I think you're right to say that it does feel a bit like theater. And I think the reason for that is because people are recognizing the need to innovate. They recognize there's a lot of competition in the world, and that they need to engage in this area of innovation. Challenge for them is that they don't necessarily understand how to do that well. So I think there are some aspects of innovation that, to work in that kind of context, they need to be more sensitive and aware of. But actually, before we go down that path, I think it's probably worth making a distinction, because I think in the world of financial services, the language of innovation can actually refer to two things that are quite different, or even digital transformation for that matter. One of them is looking at the fact that they have these legacy systems that have been running the banks for decades, and there's been a lack of investment in those systems, and bringing those up to par is part of what some organizations refer to as digital transformation. Okay. Rightfully so. However, that can be conflated with another thing which is quite different, which is to innovate, to actually make things that are new. And the truth of the matter is both are important. You can't really do the new stuff when you've got this creaky old stuff that is preventing you from being able to leverage new technologies, integrate with these new platforms and so on. So I think it's worthwhile making that distinction. And I think there's not really a lot to say about the legacy upgrade process, because it's pretty well defined. It's really a matter of playing catch up for all the decades of not investing in the systems that they've been using to run the banks. So if we put that aside for a second and we talk about making new things, I think one of the big challenges that organizations face is not understanding how do you measure and breed an environment to make successful outcomes from innovation and expenditure or investment. So it's going to be more concrete in what I mean. When you're trying to innovate and create new digital products, the measures of progress, for instance, are very different than what you might be used to in running an organization's, on a day-to-day basis, kind of the business as usual type activities. So if you create a new financial product, as an example, the way you would measure success is, how many people you have using the product, how much revenue you're making from it, how profitable is it? And those are very reasonable things in the space of innovation, but you can't ask those questions too early. Because innovation, it's a nice, sexy sounding word, but the truth of the matter is it's actually all about experimentation. Right. And so when you're running experiments, you have to recognize that an experiment means you don't know the outcome. If you knew the outcome, it's not an experiment, right? And in fact, that's paraphrasing something that Jeff Bezos said.
I think banks hate more than not knowing the outcome.
It's really different to their culture to have this notion that you're going to do something and you don't actually know what's going to happen. And as I was saying, Jeff Bezos used that exact language, saying you cannot separate innovation from experimentation, and experiments mean you don't know what the outcome is going to be, and therefore you're going to have failure. And so I think that's one of the big challenges for financial service organizations particularly, but it's happening in lots of large organizations as well. But financial services organizations are very much attached to direct correlation between investment and return on investment. So I think that's one big one. And I think another one is finding the right kind of people to lead these innovation ideas and experiments, is because you have the idea of an intrapreneur. I think that's a term that kind of got real popularity.
We'll be talking about that later.
Okay. It got real popularity in the 80s. I think it was a time when there was a real recognition that there was something about bringing entrepreneurial spirit into the corporate environment. And so you had these people who were mavericks and wanted to kind of make things happen, but they were inside the corporate structure and they were seen as people who could bring an entrepreneur mindset into the environment. And I think what we've learned over all that time is that there is a real difference between being an entrepreneur and being an intrapreneur. And I think when you're trying to find leadership for these types of programs, these innovation programs, that can be a challenge, is how do you find the people who have the right level of hunger the right level of leadership, understand having a product mindset, which that's the whole topic we can touch on if you like. I think all of those things are making it difficult for these large organizations to be successful, and therefore has the look of theater, when in fact I think there's genuine interest. I think it's not playing out the way people expected.
So there's a lot to unbundle there.
Okay.
I'm going to start with what you brought up first in the question, which I think is very important, this difference between improving on legacy systems and building something new, and whether or not those two things are mutually exclusive. And it kind of leads me into my next question. What are some of the challenges banks are facing when they start a digital transformation / innovation program?
Yeah. So I think there's a number of things that are working against them in a sense, or at least that they have to overcome. And I think maybe that hasn't surfaced as clearly over the past, and maybe there's an opportunity now for that to start to happen. But one of them is, like I said, you need to find the right people to lead these. But you also are dealing with an environment that's very different than, let's say, a startup. I think there are a lot of people who are advocating that large corporates should act more like startups, but in a sense, I think that's false advice. A large corporate will never be a startup. And the truth of the matter is, startups wish they had a lot of things that large corporates have. So you really don't want to be like a startup. But there are things to take from that. And to do that isn't easy. To separate what is appropriate for startup behavior and what's more appropriate for large corporate behavior trying to do innovation. So I think that's a huge challenge as well. And then I also think that this legacy system and platform stuff is something I think people are working on. It's actually a relatively solvable problem, and the big challenge there is just money and time.
Which we all have so much.
We have so much of that. But the thing is, if you underinvest, you got to pay at some point. And that's what's coming now. I think large organizations are recognizing this underinvestment cannot continue that way. So it is a money and time problem, but it's not an intractable problem. It's one that you just have to figure out how they're going to finance and justify when the timing is to do it. However, that is also a constraint to the pace at which you can innovate, because you need to rely on these platforms to integrate with newer technologies. That said, there's a whole nother category of challenges. Financial services, heavily regulated environment. So it means that it's another set of hurdles that
we can't move fast and break.
Yeah,
things.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah, that language, that the Silicon Valley move fast and break things. It's great when you don't have those anchors holding you back and holding you down. But when you're a financial services organization who's subject to compliance and regulatory and those sort of things, I think that is it's not the best advice for that kind of situation. So I think these are very real hurdles that financial services organizations and other large organizations also struggle with when they want to innovate. But that's not insurmountable. It's really about understanding how do you set these up so that you have the right mindset around a product. How does digital product actually manifest, and what's the life cycle look like? So I mentioned earlier that if you're using sort of the same metrics as you might for a financial services product versus a digital product, you're not gonna get very far. So if you're looking at measuring and putting constraints on a new idea early around the number of people who are using it, the amount of revenue and profit it's generating, if you put that on too soon, you will stifle the ability for that team to identify, are they even on the right track? So if I come back to this point about being in an experimental sort of mindset or state of mind, that means that you're going to try something, and there is a very good chance what you're going to start out with is going to be wrong. But that's okay. That's kind of how it works. You're looking for where does your product market fit happen, and that's by a series of trying things, getting people to try to use it, see how they respond, what's the uptake, and if it's looking like it's not quite right, you shift, you try some other things. But that only works when there's an environment that's tolerant of seeing that as progress as opposed to failure. So yeah, I think these are some of the challenges that face financial services organizations in trying to turn their efforts towards innovation towards being much more successful.
I'm glad that you've been talking a bit about experimentation. And there's another word I wanted to bring up. It's a word that's used a lot in Silicon Valley, which is failure. And I'm sure, failure is not a word that a lot of people inside banks are happy with. But, in terms of the culture that you're describing of experimenting, do you think we need a different word for fail?
Absolutely. I think the language of failure, although it's correct, it's just very difficult for people to embrace. And I think the reason why is because historically failure, if you were leading something and it failed, that would equate to you being incompetent in some way. Whereas what we're talking about is the failure of ideas as opposed to the failure of the people who are leading, trying to make those ideas come to life. So I think there's a real challenge there to get people to embrace the language of failure to mean what it means in the language of experimentation as opposed to performance. Yeah.
It's a whole sort of redefinition of performance
Yeah,
as well.
it is.
Because it's really hard to sort of tell someone you should be not afraid to fail if that failure means you've lost your job.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I think if organizations can look at in innovation as more like a portfolio where you would have several innovative ideas on the go, knowing that only a select few of those will actually be worthwhile to pursue, then failure might mean something else. When you look at placing all your bets on something and expecting putting the pressure that it has to be a success, that's when it's going to be very difficult to extricate this idea of failure from experimentation. So yeah, I think that's definitely a move in the direction that's necessary to get innovation to actually operate the way it should.
So this does lead me into probably one of my favorite topics of all time, and it's the difference between an intrapreneur and an entrepreneur.
Yeah.
I mean, we hear this a lot, when people talking in innovation labs at banks, think like a startup, entrepreneurial mindset. But are they actually the same thing?
They really aren't. I think that entrepreneurship should be inspired by what you see happening with entrepreneurs. But the truth is, they're really quite different beasts. A person who is willing to, take money from their friends and family because they're very passionate about an idea they believe is going to be successful, who, once they get started, is operating in a sense of survival mode, they will act differently than someone who may have some of those characteristics but are operating within the net inside of a large corporation. So I think there is something to be said for having those types of people lead innovation inside of large organizations, but we should not expect them to act in the same way an entrepreneur would. In fact, people who are true entrepreneurs would never work inside of a large corporate because they believe that will constrain them in ways that would prevent them from being able to succeed in the way they want to succeed. I think another thing is those large organizations cannot give the kind of incentives that an entrepreneur has. Entrepreneur's upside incentive, as far as they see it, whether they're right or wrong, is infinite. They are looking to succeed in a way that would be very difficult to have the kind of upside that they'd have working inside a large organization. And I think that defines the kind of person who's prepared to do that versus to work inside this somewhat safer environment of a large corporate. So incentivizing entrepreneurs is something to be looked at because it can't be just the salary to get the same kind of motivation and attract the people who would really do it. But on the other hand, it's very difficult to give them the same environment as an entrepreneur. That said, I think we should recognize that entrepreneurs actually come with skills that are very relevant to getting innovation happening inside a large organization, because some of what they can do is they know how to navigate the complexities. They do the politics. They know they have the relationships to get things done, to work around the bureaucracy. Those are really important skills because organizations are quite structured almost to prevent people moving fast. So I think it is worth acknowledging the differences, but I don't think it means that because entrepreneurs aren't exactly like entrepreneurs, they don't have the value that large organizations need. In fact, they're very valuable in that sense. And if they act too much like an entrepreneur, the system will reject them. People will,
we've seen it. There's plenty of examples.
Yeah. It gets kind of an, what do you call it? Organ reject,
Yes.
Right? So I think that is a really important thing to remember when selecting people to lead these types of programs, that they have the right balance of understanding how to navigate a large organization, but still retain some of that hunger for success and willing to make people upset and to lead in certain ways that might be a little bit different than what you might do if you were a corporate person.
So for my final question, I have a bit of a challenge for you.
Okay.
Okay, so you have been taken into a digital transformation program that's not working.
Okay.
How do you reboot it?
Well, the first thing I do is look at what's not working. I want to know, is it that the team or the leadership team that are running that program are doing the right things? In other words, they are driving for experimentation, they are driving for learning from getting real things in the hands of users. If that's happening, but it's still not working, then I'd say not working by what metrics? Is it not working because there's pressure to align with the corporate brand too soon, where they feel a fear of damaging the brand by doing certain kinds of experiments? That might be perceived as failure, where in fact that's actually the right thing to be doing, is trying to find a way in which to experiment. And then also be looking at what metrics are being used to measure their progress. If you're saying how many users do you have signed on and you didn't meet your plans, and those are the kinds of things that could be perceived as failure, where in fact they actually are working well. Now, they could be doing all the right things and still not be making the progress they should be making, because it's not like they should just have blank checks to spend as they will. So I'd be looking at that. But if it turns out that when you've really dug under it, turns out they're doing the right things, it's just not working, then I would want to shut it down. And I think that is quite scary for large organizations. They have a tendency to not stop things. They're not so bad at starting things, but stopping can be quite difficult. The momentum is in place and no one wants to be the one to say stop.
Goes back to that idea of you can't fail.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And no one wants to be the one to say, I think we should stop this, because of how that might reflect on them. So if the answer really is it should be stopped, the most important thing is to not fire all the people because they will have gained a tremendous amount of insight and knowledge about how do you operate as a product organization, how do you have a product mindset, and then bring that to the next thing. So it's important to extract and understand the learning that can be taken from that situation and brought into the next one.
Thank you very much, Collin Lyons from ustwo. I found this a very fascinating conversation. I took a lot out of it. I'm sure everyone here watching took a lot out of our fireside chat about digital transformation. And I'm sure conversations around this topic will be continuing in this industry, in financial services and fintech, for quite some time. So thank you very much for watching.